Great. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. Just as for transparency, you are being recorded. We're being watched all the time now, so that should come as no surprise. But anyway, today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Moin Syed, who's visiting us from the Balmy University of Minnesota, where he's been for many years. When he wants to take a break from Minnesota, he travels to tropical Sweden over the summers to do research there with some collaborators. Um, we have so many overlaps with Moin. I'm going to keep this really brief because I'd rather he tell you about himself than me tell you about him. Um, we have a lot of overlaps. He did his BA and master's at the Excellent Psych program at SF State, which we have some alumni from there as well in our department. Then from there, he went on to do his doctoral work at UC Santa Cruz. He studies a lot of topics that are near and dear to my heart, like self and identity, ethnic identity. He also cares a lot about open science and methods, like a lot of us here. So yeah, this is such an awesome opportunity to get to hear from you about things that you've been thinking about lately. And so today he's going to talk to us about race, ethnicity, and culture and personality research. And so with that, please just stop me right here and take
Stop
it.
it. All right, excellent. Thanks so much, Brent. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for all of you for coming today to listen to what I have to share with you about race, ethnicity, culture, and personality research. It would be really nice if I could be there with you, of course. It's actually pretty nice in Minnesota today. I think it's pushing 50. I call it our second spring already, even though we've sort of gone through these ups and downs, had a couple snowstorms, it's melted, but we're trying to stay positive. If I was in Riverside, I would have gone to my background. Some of you hopefully can recognize it there, Tio's Tacos. Not necessarily the best tacos, but a nice atmosphere, right? So I figured I would get in the mood by having that as my background. I have an OSF link there on the title page. If you go to that link, you'll be able to find a copy of these slides as well as a rough script of what I'll be saying today. It's hard to know how closely I ever stay to those kinds of things, but I did just type out kind of all my thoughts. And so you certainly are welcome to go access those materials and use them however you see fit. And ultimately, I'll put a copy of this video up there once it's available as well. So I had a lot of different things so many different topics I could potentially talk about. And initially, the way I was thinking about things is I was intending to share some new data with you. I have various new projects, and I thought, oh, it would be great to be able to sort of to talk about some of this empirical work and share it with everybody and get some ideas. But like we all know, this is 2020, and most of our plans don't really come to fruition. So I thought instead what I would do is just share some of my wild ideas and thoughts about things. And I think that's in some ways, it's kind of what I prefer to do anyway, honestly. It's what I like to talk about ideas, especially when I have people that I can bounce ideas off. But also, so I think sort of fitting for 2020 that it's a really good time for all of us to kind of take a step back a little bit and think a little bit more deeply about what we're doing instead of just continuing to push through and push even harder, empirical studies of questionable quality at times. And that's a whole separate talk that I won't get into now. But I think that we should take this moment to sort of step back and think about our work in new and different ways. So really much of what I'm sharing today is just completely sort of my own ideas and perspectives on things. I'm not providing any real hard evidence for anything. At times I might be a little provocative or even incendiary, depending on your own view on some of these topics. And I'm sure some of you will disagree with some of my comments. I welcome that disagreement. I hope we can have productive disagreements as long as we can have a reasoned discussion and not a reactionary discussion. But much of this is just kind of ideas I'm putting out there. Oh, I should mention, we were talking about this before everyone was here. I think Brent will monitor the chat and the hands because I can't see them in my setup, and then he'll interrupt me. But if you have questions at any point, I'm happy to be interrupted. That's totally fine. So the plan today is first I'll talk a little bit about me. I think that beyond just being narcissistic, I think it's actually a little bit useful in the context of my talk to know a bit about my background and my perspective. I think it's useful for the students too to hear about sort of different pathways that some of us traverse. I'll provide some comments on my perspectives on the history and current state of personality research. Mostly that will be to set up the third part, which is on the relative absence of race and ethnicity in personality research. Oh, there's an extra "the" in there. And then part 4 is discussion. My hope is really to keep this short so we have plenty of time for discussion. However, I say that before every talk I ever give, and I never keep it short, and there's never enough time for discussion. So it's chances are low that that's going to happen, but I will be staying around a bit after for those who are interested to chat. So hopefully we'll have time to discuss. All right, so get right into it, the plan. As Brent mentioned, I did my master's degree in developmental psychology at San Francisco State University. For a variety of reasons, I became interested in birth order and personality. Yes, terrible idea, but at the time I thought this was really interesting, and so I got into birth order and personality. And when I dove into the literature, I saw that it was just kind of a mess, right? It was all over the place. There was all uncontrolled different factors, confounds. It was really the kind of literature you look at and you say, I don't know if we can really conclude anything about this. And so what I decided to do was do my master's thesis as a methodologically focused study. So it's called Birth Order and Personality, a methodological study, to really try to examine how the methods we use to approach the question contours the results that we get and impacts our conclusions. So, in today's nomenclature, that would be called a meta-scientific study. It's not a very good one, that's for sure. There are other people who are doing good meta-scientific work on birth order and personality, such as Julia Rohr. So you should check that out if you're interested. But in general, at this time, this is a developmental program, but I was bringing in a personality focus. So from my master's era, I was already kind of thinking about how developmental and personality kind of might fit together. As Brent mentioned, I then went on to my PhD at UC Santa Cruz in developmental. There are two kind of funky things about Santa Cruz psychology. First, they're one of the few programs in the country that have the developmental program that has an explicit emphasis on the cultural nature of development. So it's sort of infused throughout all of the curriculum and all of the teaching and everything. And that's really the reason I wanted to go there, is because that's the kind of perspective I wanted to get. More relevant in many ways to my topic today, it might be the only program in the country, and if someone can correct me if I'm wrong, in which developmental and personality are actually part of the same training program. So developmental personality are sort of together. So, of course, personality is often with social or by itself, but their developmental and personality are together. So throughout my doctoral years, I was socialized really to think of cultural psychology, developmental, and personality as all sort of being interconnected and related to one another. So then I went on to my faculty position at Minnesota. They were hiring a cultural psychologist, open area, so affiliated with any training program. They ended up hiring me, a developmentalist, but developmental at Minnesota is actually in a different department, the Institute for Child Development, in a different college. I don't know if Tuppet is here, but Tuppet's a graduate of that program. And so they sort of had to figure out what to do with me. And at the time, my work was related, what I was doing was related to counseling psychology. And so I had a primary affiliation with the counseling area, but then a secondary affiliation with the personality, individual differences, and behavior genetics area, what we call PIB. So their personality and social are separate. So I had this connection with a personality training program. Over time, my interest kind of shifted a little bit. My focus shifted more towards personality. And so I made a full shift to being part of the personality training program, no longer affiliated with counseling. So, by training, I'm a cultural developmental psychologist with a bit of personality. By practice, I'm in a personality perspective. You could say the one thing that's been stable across all these different contexts has been personality. Big surprise. You could also say my affinity for large public universities with semi-brutalist buildings is also one of my affinities. But so all of that has been really informative in terms of how I think about personality and developmental and culture, that I have this particular view that's quite separate from thinking about it from a social psychological perspective. So I just want to take a few moments to lay that out, because I think it is really important to understand that foundation of my perspective before I get into some of the details. Now, as I said in my abstract, Bill Revell famously said that personality is the last refuge of the generalist in psychology, right? For all these reasons, that personality is really the area of psychology that still takes that generalist mindset. When I first saw this, I thought it was kind of funny, because I feel like developmentalists always say this. Also, they feel like developmental is the last refuge of the generalist. I was taught to be a developmentalist means you're an everything psychologist for basically all the same reasons that are being laid out right here. I was also, as I mentioned, socialized to think about developmental and personality fitting together. This is a great paper if you haven't read it. It's pretty short, by Brewster Smith, kind of talking about the history of the relation between personality and social psychology, sort of arguing that probably that's a union that's time has come, and that it would be much better for personality to be in stronger conversation with developmental psychology. That those two programs, really, those approaches have a lot more in common, and it would be super productive to have them better aligned. So again, as I mentioned, really my entire, so even though personality has been very stable in my background, my entire socialization around personality has been really separate from seeing it as part of social psychology. Okay, that's my quick background. Let's get into some of the juice here. So I want to say a little bit about my thoughts on the history and state of personality research, again, largely to set up thinking about how race, ethnicity, and culture might fit in here. Some of you might recognize that the title of my talk is a play on Ray Carlson's classic article, Where is the Person in Personality Research? At the time, Carlson castigated the field for not emphasizing the sort of the roots of personality, really thinking about people and thinking about their context. And a lot has changed since then, I'd say. I think we have started to think more about the person and personality research since Carlson wrote this paper. You can see it through narrative research. This is the correct Will Dunlop, who does personality research here, narrative research. So narrative has certainly embraced sort of the personological view of personality research, but you see it also in the focus more on intra-individual variability and within person dynamics, as well as what's often referred to as the idiographic approach to personality. So in recent years, we've seen a much larger increase in thinking about personality in a variety of dynamic and interesting ways. Now, I am not about to venture into discussing the person by situation debates and everything that goes along with that. You, of course, have General David Funder here to be able to regale you with tales about that era, and that, well, some maybe say it continues. And David, I don't know you at all, but I just felt like you needed that hat when I was thinking about you and your contributions to this work, and that was the best fitting hat I could find. But I think what strikes me when I reflect on personality research now is it really has this broad kind of integrative approach. And I think part of that, at least, was because that the field was really pushed to the precipice. Right, it was really, its very existence in many ways was threatened about its role in the field and the future of personality research. And so it was really to the advantage of personality research to be open and welcoming, and to recognize how different lines of research fit within a personality perspective. It helped to provide some justification for why personality is important and should be part of mainstream psychology. And I think now we see, being able to look back on that trajectory, that we see, or at least I perceive, really a thriving area of research that's quite successful, in part because it has emphasized integration and pulling together these themes that you see across the field. That might be surprising for some people, especially outsiders to the area, because so many people think of personality only as traits. Right, especially those who are outside of the area tend to think of, when you say personality, they think personality traits. Of course, we know that this is not the case, right? That personality is not only about traits. And personality psychologists know this as well, although they don't always behave like it, right? Sometimes there's still comments or sort of implicitly suggesting that personality and traits are one and the same. I don't know how many times I have to make comments to colleagues or as a reviewer or whatever about, please don't just say personality when you mean personality traits. Like, you need to have that level of specificity, because traits are not the entirety of personality, and it actually harms our understanding of the field to treat it as if that's the case. Rather, I feel like the field has generally been quite receptive and embracing of what McAdams initially laid out, and then McAdams and Powell's, in terms of having this integrative view of personality. Yes, this is a wall of text, but this is the McAdams and Powell's definition of personality, that it's conceived as an individual's unique variation on the general evolutionary design for human nature, expressed as a developing pattern of dispositional traits characteristic adaptations, and self-defining life narratives, complexly and differentially situated in culture and social context. That's obviously a huge mouthful and not something that you'd want to have to memorize. However, we can think of it visually. Right. What this definition is saying is there are three organizational components to personality. We can think of personality as consisting of traits, characteristic adaptations, and life narratives, all of which are informed by and developing within and influenced by both biological processes and cultural processes. Right. So we cannot ignore the biological or the cultural, that they both have influences on all three of these different levels of personality. I like to order it in this way a little bit because I think it helps to see the way in which they're related. I think I'll just briefly mention what traits, adaptations, and life narratives are. Certainly, I think many are probably familiar with this, but we can talk more about it if those are interested. But traits are those relatively stable, enduring aspects of individual differences. I said relatively for all those who are listening, relatively stable individual differences. They can be thought of, I'm not here to start a fight about trait hierarchies, but we can generally think about the traits as falling in a hierarchy of meta traits, domains, aspects, and facets, and so on. Characteristic adaptations are sort of the more nebulous dimension of personality. McAdams and Powell's really talked about them in terms of context-specific reactions to one's environment or context-specific ways of configuring one's life in response to environmental cues. I think my colleague Colin DeYoung did a nice job honing that in a little bit. He basically said we can think of characteristic adaptations as goals, interpretations, and strategies. That this pretty much captures the idea that these are contextually specific adaptations that are distinct from traits. And then finally, with life narratives, this is really about how individuals are pulling together and making meaning of their variety of characteristic adaptations and experiences and pulling them together into a sense of continuity and individuality over time. I'm just going to skip over a few non-interesting parts here for a second. I think one of the useful ways of thinking about it, and the reason why I lay it out kind of in this continuous format, is where they're located in space is actually useful to thinking about their interrelations with one another. So, traits have, a lot of this is, we're not too sure about this, but traits have a stronger biological component than do characteristic adaptations. And life narratives are even further away from the biological side of things. Coming from the other side, culture is playing a strong role on life narrative characteristic adaptations, but relatively less on traits. Okay, so it's not a linear sort of push and pull kind of thing, but in general, you can think about the way these are organized in proximal space, that you can link traits and characteristic adaptations maybe a little bit more easily than you could link traits and life narratives. And you generally see this in the personality literature. This is kind of the way the research tends to fall out. Collectively, as part of this model and just more general in terms of personality research maturing and broadening, you see a move away from a heavy focus on psychometrics. Of course, that's still there and it should be, but a little bit less on psychometrics and more on additional implications for policy, for health, for life outcomes, right? Thinking about the relevance of personality and different dimensions of personality for other aspects of psychological variation. Now, but most of this has really been on the side of biology and traits and a little bit with characteristic adaptations. So as personality research has gotten more and more prominent, it's still very much focused on the biological side of things, focusing on traits, focusing on characteristic adaptations a little bit, and maybe a little bit of the connection between them and among them, but less so on life narrative and culture. You can see this, that there's a journal called Personality Neuroscience. That's all about, it's largely traits, although there's some characteristic adaptations are related to biological processes. Where's the journal Personality and Culture? Right? There's no similar journal. Is Cambridge interested in publishing such a journal? Probably not, right? There's generally been less interest in this particular topic or that side of this continuum. So in general, I ask this question of where are race, ethnicity, and culture in personality research? If personality is the last refuge of the generalist, as Ravel says, how has cultural psychology not been part of the field? Why is it not in there if that's sort of the mentality that personality psychologists are bringing? Okay, so that brings me to part 3, was the place of race and ethnicity in personality research. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that there has been no integration of cultural psychology into personality research. That's just false. There's a collection of papers that you can see of different perspectives and approaches that have done so. There's a variety of different conceptualizations of culture and of personality. I would say a lot of this looks a bit more social psychology like to me than personality at times. For example, the work by Marcus and Kitayama, which focuses on sort of binary conceptions of interdependent, independent selves. I'm going to say more about that later, actually, so I'll just table that for right now. But generally speaking, there is work on culture and personality, but it's of a particular flavor. It's a particular type at the exclusion of other types. So it's helpful to look at this paper in particular toward a new approach to the study of personality and culture. And Chung et al. In this paper outline 2 broad approaches to culture and personality that you see in the literature. The first is cross-cultural psychology, or what they call the EDIC approach, and the second is cultural psychology, or what they call the EMIC approach. These are 2 important approaches to have distinguished when thinking about cultural psychology. Cross-cultural psychology is fundamentally rooted in a universalist view of psychological phenomenon. The primary goal of cross-cultural psychology is really to establish universals and invariants across cultures. The metaphor that's often used to represent cross-cultural psychology is the onion. So cross-cultural psychologists are often looking to peel out the outer layers of the onion of cultural variability to get to that inner essence or core of similarity and sameness across cultures. This Schwader has a nice paper I linked in my comments that discusses what this all looks like. This is often surprising for people to hear because they often don't think of cross-cultural psychology as being interested in universals, but that's usually what is driving a cross-cultural psychological investigation. That's ultimately what the goal is. In contrast, with cultural psychology, the goal is not to identify universals, but to understand local meanings and mentalities and trying to understand how psychological phenomena are expressed within a cultural context. Cultural psychologists don't necessarily reject the idea of universals. In fact, they often endorse the idea of universals. In particular, that maybe some processes might be universals, like the process of developing an identity. I think that's probably a universal psychological process. The content of it, the way in which it's carried out, what it looks like, things of that nature, that's going to vary by cultural context, and that those contents are then also going to impact the processes. They will have an impact on that universal component. That's more in line with kind of a cultural psychological way of thinking about psychology in general versus seeking to identify invariants in universals. As Chung et al. Describe in this paper, so they outline a number of different approaches that use the cross-cultural or the cultural approach, and they advocate for research that really should bridge the two. So you can do a combination of both cross-cultural and cultural. And really what they're talking about is trying to identify what is universal and what is culture specific. And they identify the South African personality inventory and the Chinese personality assessment inventory as examples of this kind of blended cross-cultural and cultural psych work. So 2 things about that. First, this paper the title needed a little edit because it's really about the study of personality traits in culture. Okay, so they're not talking about personality in general, they're talking about personality traits specifically. So this is an example of what I was talking about. Second, and most relevant, is they don't mention or discuss ethnicity and race at all in this context. There's not a word about ethnicity or race or how that fits in with this general conceptualization of a cultural approach to personality. And it's important because there is another form. There's many different ways of categorizing the cultural approaches we use in psychology, but generally there's 3 big ones: cross-cultural, cultural, and ethnic minority psychology. Okay, ethnic minority psychology is quite different from cross-cultural and cultural in that the focus tends to be on the psychological experience of minorities within a given national context. And the minority part is particularly important because it's about what's really embedded within an ethnic minority psychology is thinking about issues of power and oppression and privilege. So bringing in those structural considerations and how societal structures and disproportionate access to power and opportunity are associated with psychological processes. You don't see that in cross-cultural psychology, like really at all. Maybe here and there, but basically not at all. And most types of cultural psychology also don't have a strong emphasis on that, although there are some that do. So that's a whole separate issue. So what we're seeing here is that in general, even when we're talking, this is a paper that was published in American Psychologists, and I don't mean to pick on this paper, I sort of do, but I don't really mean to pick on this paper, but it was published in American Psychologist, very high profile, saying this is a new approach to studying personality and culture, but it's still a very limited view, focusing on these sort of more comfortable topics for a lot of psychological researchers, right? Getting into the structural considerations and starting to think about power and oppression and privilege, for some psychologists, that's territory that's a little less familiar to them. They might not be as willing to go in that direction. And that's kind of what you've seen with personality research is they're okay going in the cultural, but not so much with the ethnicity and the ethnic and racial. This is interesting for a variety of ways, for a variety of reasons. One is that there's this whole parallel area of research in developmental ethnic minority psychology, who's really working squarely at the level of characteristic adaptations. So they're studying things like identity and agency and empowerment and all these kind of resilient psychological processes that are very clearly a characteristic adaptations and sometimes even actually measured as traits. Right, the way that they're actually assessed. I mean, there's people there in your department, Erica Britton-Lloyd, Diamond Bravo, Tuppet Yates, Cecilia Chung, are all doing this kind of work, right? This is mostly what I do. But these folks generally don't call themselves personality psychologists, right? They tend to not identify with personality in any way. And I'm not speaking for your colleagues, I'm just saying in general, and also tend to kind of actively distance themselves a bit from personality at times. So clearly doing personality work, they should be part of the big tent of personality, and yet they really aren't. So the question is why, right? Why do we not see a greater integration between work that's clearly relevant to personality and the more mainstream personality psychology? So I'm going to offer a couple ideas here. Some of these you may not like. These are the kinds of comments that, yeah, you could strongly disagree with some of these. Some of these, I'm totally fine with that. But these are some ideas I have for why I think there's not so much of a connection between the two. First, personality researchers tend to be bullish on the universalism of trait structures. So sometimes you'll see, direct claims of the big five or hexaco or choose whatever structure you want is a universal structure. Sometimes it's more of implied in terms of comments, but it's often suggested that this is sort of a universal known kind of finding. Certainly there is plenty of evidence for various structures, but have we really done sufficient work to be able to say that it truly generalizes to the point of being universal? Pretty sure that hasn't been the case. This came up recently. My doctoral advisee, Aisha Udochi, who I think is here today watching, we're doing a project related to this, and she was doing a literature search, and she said, I must be doing something wrong because I can't seem to find many studies that are comparing the measurement of the big five across different racial ethnic groups. I said, no, you're not doing something wrong. There actually aren't very many of those studies at all that have been done. That just hasn't been a very strong focus of the field. And what's particularly interesting about this is a lot of personality trait psychologists in particular will assert the universality of trait structures and the importance of traits. And a lot of ethnic minority psychologists will actually reject the idea that the trait structures are relevant for ethnic minority psychology, but neither of them are speaking from any solid evidence. Right? So it's impressions that have been given based on the existing literature and the dynamics. They feel this is the case, but there isn't strong evidence to support either of those claims. It's just that evidence is essentially absent. So that's one kind of problem, I think, in terms of the relations. A second is that personality researchers are bullish on the universalism of genetics. So often the genetic basis of personality is overstated. To be clear, there is ample evidence for the genetic basis and the heritability of personality traits, right? This is Turkheimer's first law of behavior genetics, that most traits are substantially heritable. The problem is we slip into going back to the problem of equating personality with personality traits. I often see Turkheimer's first law, which is clearly about traits, then be extrapolated to be about personality in general, right? So personality is strongly heritable, but we really don't know that that's the case because there haven't been very many studies on the heritability of characteristic adaptations, for example. My other PhD student, Lynn Nguyen, who I don't think was able to make it today, she led a very nice review paper, which we examined this, and we found very few behavior genetic studies that are actually examining characteristic adaptations. In terms of personality, the vast majority of it is focusing on traits. And of course, ethnic minority psychologists have good reason to be skeptical about strong claims for the genetic basis of behavior, right? There's a history there. Again, that's a separate talk, but there's good reason for when seeing genetics being asserted, absent certain evidence, that people get skittish. Okay, third, personality research is overly dispositional. Now, this might seem like kind of a silly thing to say because in some ways personality research is defined in terms of its focus on dispositions, but just because a field is focused on dispositions, it doesn't mean it needs to be overly dispositional. So focusing heavily on the individual attitudes, beliefs, traits, etc. I mentioned earlier how ethnic minority psychologists are often doing personality psychology. That's true, but they're often doing more as well because they're considering, as I mentioned, issues of social structures and power and oppression. They have those additional kind of societal components and thinking about how those potentially contour the expression of personality traits and other personality processes. However, some of the mainstream kind of takes on the value of personality, especially in applied settings, tends to have a very strong individualistic kind of free opportunity way of conceptualization. So a good example of that is grit, or the more generalized form of conscientiousness. It's sort of like if you work hard and you stay motivated, that you'll be successful. And ethnic minority researchers just know that that's not the case, and there's evidence of that being the case. So there's sort of this negative view of personality research being too focused on dispositions at the expense of structures. Fourth, this is the one that some of you particularly won't like probably, but I think personality research is compromised by its association with social psychology. Now, hear me out. There's good reason for this. I think when personality research does think about context, it naturally goes to its frenemy, social psychology, which is right next door, to think about how should we think about social context. Well, social psychology overwhelmingly focuses on the micro context, right? The situation, and not so much on the macro context of societal structures and how those are related to psychological processes. So when personality researchers are thinking about how to be more contextual or to bring in those contextual features, they naturally are going more into that lower level of context and not that broader level of context that is really the focus of ethnic minority research. So this is where I say it's sort of compromise. It makes sense that because, like such as at Riverside, the training programs are together. It makes sense there's this close proximity that there would be that connection. But because social psychology focuses so much on the micro versus the macro, there's a great paper by Oishi et al. By the way, it talks about the history of that, of social psychology moving away from the macro towards the micro. It's in the notes that I posted. So that further moves it away from the direction that a lot of ethnic minority psychologists are thinking. Finally, and this is kind of the core point, I think, and I'll be moving towards ending on this point, personality research is not really well equipped to study group variation. So much of the focus is on individual variation and co-variation, but less so, and documenting group variation, but less so on understanding group variation. I'll give you an illustration of what I mean here. So I promised I'd come back to Marcus and Kitayama. Just in full disclosure, I take every opportunity I can to talk about the problems with this model, both conceptually and methodologically. Again, that's an entirely separate talk. Right now, I'm just going to focus on the methodological issues. This paper has been one of the most important and impactful papers in the history of psychology, and continues to this day to impact the way that we think about culture in social, personality, cognitive, developmental, less so developmental these days, but in all these different areas. So it's been a huge impact. And it's part of people's prelims and comps and qualifying exams and all those kinds of things. There is this little read, but what I would say a must-read paper by Matsumoto about really examining the claims in Marcus and Kitayama closely. And Matsumoto is a cultural psychologist, personality psychologist, very well equipped to be able to evaluate these claims. What he argued is that their model was essentially this, what I'm showing here. This is taken from Matsumoto. The model was that cultural variations are related to variations in self-construals. So variations associated with culture lead to these different self-construals. So having a more independent self or a more interdependent self. And those variations in turn are associated with these differences that we observe in cognition, emotion, and motivation. That was the thrust of their argument. Their original paper is 30-page, 2-column, 8-point font, really, really robust. But this was the point, right? This model right here is the bottom line of what they were arguing. And Matsumoto very clearly acknowledges that this was, they integrated so much different literature across so many different areas and really made a compelling case for this model. No question about that. And that's one of the reasons it's had such impact. But when you look at the actual evidence in support of the model, it doesn't look like this. It looks like this. The evidence is comparing participants from 2 or more countries on some sort of psychological processes. Culture is not measured. Self-construals are not measured. Right? So what the evidence actually is for the theory is country-level differences in psychological processes, which could literally be due to anything, right? Who knows what it is? But this was the evidence that was provided for this particular model. The kicker here is that Matsumoto's paper was published in 1999. You could remove that date and put 2020 and it would be just as accurate. This continues to be the case. I collect the articles as I see them published. I say, did they measure culture? No. Did they measure self-construals? No. They're cross-national studies of psychological processes. That's fine, but you don't know what is the source of those differences. You're just observing some differences. Right? And this continues to be perpetuated within the literature. And the ideas that were laid out in the Marcus and Kitayama original article are used as a way to make sense of those observed findings, but there's not actually an empirical basis to support those inferences. Those are theoretical ideas. And so this is kind of gold standard type level work within personality and social psychology of culture. And it's interesting because especially personality psychology in so many ways has been so sophisticated in terms of its analytic approach to think about individuality, variation, interactions with persons and situations, all those kinds of things. But the approach to studying group differences has remained at this very weak level of not being able to actually learn much of anything about why those groups differ in the first place. This is a paper that it's just one I saw. It came out like a week or two ago, and so it was on my mind, looking at variations in the Hexaco traits across countries, ethnicities, and sex differences. There's nothing here for you to comprehend necessarily, just to know that all of this was categorical differences. There were categorical sex differences, categorical country differences, categorical ethnic differences, with nothing built in to try to understand why those differences even existed. And the discussion section is filled with speculations and suggestions, and this is why this might be happening, this is why this might be happening. But none of that was actually measured. And again, this is kind of standard course research within personality psychology. Ethnic minority psychologists are very skeptical of that kind of work. right? Group comparative work that does not include the explanatory mechanism. Why is that the case? Because historically, and continues to this day, comparative work that doesn't include any kind of way to understand those comparisons across the groups often relies on a deficit interpretation to understand the nature of any observed differences. So if there's observed differences of some kind, the dominant group, so if we're talking about ethnicity and race in the US, we're talking about the white group is considered the standard, and then the ethnic minority groups are considered as deviations from that standard. That's what the deficit model is. That's a default interpretive framework that's being used. Coming back to here, you could just as easily apply a deficit framework to this line of research if you want to, instead of the Marcus and Kintayama way of thinking about it. It's wide open if you do group differences without having some kind of explanatory mechanism. So this kind of work in general is just not the kind of thing that's consistent with the approach of ethnic minority psychology that's trying to move away from that sort of reification of the idea of groups having meaning and trying to get into the psychological experience and variation of those groups and how that's related to some psychological outcomes or just on its own. So just to put this in more concrete personality terms, if you're looking at traits, looking at variations in big five traits, is a fun trivia question for students if they know why I order it as NEOAC. I think that's a historical artifact at this point, but there's a very specific reason why I order it that way. If you look at differences among Black, Latino, and whites in the five traits, again, you could do a study like this where you just look at mean differences. Again, you have no idea what is the source of those differences. Why do they differ? It's not because of the groups. The groups don't have any inherent characteristics. The groups are just proxies for a huge bundle of psychological variation, right? And that's true for any categorical variable, gender, immigration, whatever you want to talk about. They're just proxies for more interesting or more active psychological processes. So the question is, why would you see these differences? Well, one argument could be if you think that the traits might have some cultural specificity, that the degree to which individuals identify with their cultural background might lead them to look different in terms of their traits. That it might be because they're more closely aligned with the cultural values and practices of their ethnic background. So then we could put a variable construct like ethnic identity in here and say, does ethnic identity, the degree to which individuals identify with their ethnic group, which is a level 2 characteristic adaptation, does that account for any observed group differences? Right? Is that why we see group differences? Because we see the groups vary on this construct. You could do a similar thing in terms of thinking about measurement and variance as well. So just to close here, what this research is doing, another way to think about it, if you go back to my kind of comments about the continuum of sorts here, what you're seeing is an attempt to link cultural issues with traits. But because the proximal nature of these different dimensions, you're essentially bypassing some critical components of life narrative and characteristic adaptation to really get the insight into why those variations are there in the traits. In other words, to understand how culture is related to variations in traits, you probably have to look sort of pass through narratives and characteristic adaptations. That these provide some of those explanatory mechanisms for why you see those variations in traits. If we were to do this, like really seriously unify this kind of approach and build this into our studies, then we could move towards this nice hunky-dory world of a personality developmental ethnic minority psychology, or a truly generalist kind of psychology. All right, part 4, I've talked enough. Thanks for listening.